along to another themed week here on Property Tribes. It is HMO Compliance Week as we count down to new legislation coming into effect on the 1st of October. And joining me to present that content is one of the UK's foremost authorities on HMOs. It's David Smith of Anthony Gold Solicitors and also, of course, Policy Director for the RLA. And David, I'm so glad to have your input for this week. I think it is a much needed week. Are you concerned about the level of awareness amongst HMO landlords of what their compliance requirements are?
Yes, I think a lot of people think that HMOs aren't a problem or it's just renting to somebody else. The law is very different on HMOs. There are a lot more obligations. The penalties are much more severe. And as we start to regulate the sector more tightly, it's an area which local authorities are looking at more and more because there are greater risks, and some of the poorest people in the country and the most vulnerable people in the country can be found in HMOs. And so it's something they take very seriously, and landlords need to take very seriously as well.
Indeed. Some of the topics that we're going to be talking about are room sizes, which is very interesting. We're going to be talking about management regulations, who is responsible for the licence, when to apply for the licence. So we've got a load of really great content coming up, hosted by David. And one of the things that came out of our video session for me, David, was particularly on the management regulations. You were very keen to stress how an HMO landlord has to be far more proactive and actually have a management plan, whereas a single occupancy buy-to-let landlord letting to a family doesn't have that. They're two very different types of management, aren't they?
Yes, and one of the areas in which I see people making really serious mistakes is people who are very good landlords or agents in a general sense and normally let to families and do a little bit of HMO on the side and think it's more of the same. It really isn't. If you're letting to a family, the simple reality is it's to some extent reactive. They report stuff, you deal with it promptly, you've done your job. When it comes to HMOs, there are management regulations. If you're not in compliance with those, you are breaking the law. It's a criminal offence. You can be prosecuted, and you don't get a warning. You don't get the local authority saying, "Oh, you're in breach of the regulations. We'd like you to fix it, please." They say you're in breach of the regulations, and we are going to prosecute you for that. So you need to be much more aware of what's going on. You need to make sure you're not in breach of the regulations, and you need to be able to show that if there is a problem, it's a once in a blue moon rare event and not the standard course of business.
Absolutely. And as you mentioned, and you'll be giving more details later in the week, to have an actual spreadsheet documenting visits to the properties, any issues that arose, what was undertaken to correct that issue, because all of that would be needed for documentary evidence if there ever was a complaint going forwards.
Yeah, it's not enough just to actually do these things. You have to be able to show that you've done these things. Local authorities are a bit suspicious of landlords, rightly or wrongly, but to some extent rightly, because they get fobbed off a lot. They're always told by somebody, "Oh, this isn't really what happens normally." So you need to be able to show that actually this is really not what happens normally, and this is an unusual set of events.
Now, what's your view on this term that crops up from time to time? People say, "Oh, I've got a mini-mo."
Yeah, I've seen it once or twice. I think what they of course mean is they have an HMO that's not licensable. I don't really see the difference. An HMO is an HMO. If you have an HMO, then whether it's licensable or not, you're subject to the management regulations and you can be prosecuted. So to think that because you don't have a fully licensable HMO that you don't have to comply with the same standards is mostly mistaken. You pretty much do. Okay, you don't have to pay for a license and there might be some license conditions that are missing, but essentially there's no difference in law between the two scenarios. So I think it's quite a dangerous situation. I much prefer people to talk about HMOs that don't require licensing, bearing in mind that at some future date they could require licensing if people change their minds. And indeed, that's what's happening in October for some people, and HMOs that do require licensing in this context. So, minimo is a dangerous phrase, which to some extent risks misleading people into thinking they don't have obligations they do in fact have.
Indeed, and there will be landlords out there who are going to have to kind of think again about their HMOs because the room sizes do not conform as of the 1st of October. I mean, what can they do? I mean, can they use that room kind of as storage, or provide extra facilities for the tenant, perhaps as a theatre room or a laundry room or something of that nature?
Well, rooms that aren't available,
Sleeping
the
rooms,
room
yeah.
size standard is about sleeping rooms.
Yeah.
So you can't use those rooms as sleeping rooms. If they're not available as rooms, yes, you can use them for anything else you want, as long as it's not for sleeping in. And in practice, that would be better, of course, because if it's repurposed in such a way that the tenant can't cheat behind your back and let it out to a lodger, you're in a sense eliminating a risk. So if you can, for example, turn it into a laundry room so it can't be used for sleeping because it's got washing machines or something in it, then that actually is better than just leaving it and saying to tenants, do what you want. Obviously, in some cases, people might be able to do a bit of jiggling around and change room sizes so they can make them bigger and make them usable, but that will be very dependent, of course, on the individual property. And I think the government sort of seems to have a view that anyone can do that, but the reality is that's simply not true. And daytime TV has a lot to answer for, and that may be one of its crimes. It suggests that all properties are immediately adjustable with a crowbar and a bit of jiggling of stud walls. It's not always that easy.
No, quite. One issue we didn't cover actually in the week's content, David, is if there's an extra person appears in the HMO, say it's the girlfriend of one of the tenants and she is there 5 nights a week, apart from obviously that might cause an issue with the other tenants, how does that affect the licence status of the property? When does she be determined to be a full-time resident or no longer a guest?
There is no hard and fast rule. It depends on each case. I would generally advise someone who's operating an HMO to have some pretty robust clauses in there, restricting how many nights the same visitor can turn up. I usually put something in like not more than 2 to 3 nights a week and not more than 10 or 15 nights in a month. That's quite onerous, but there is no reason why you cannot do that, and that would be a legitimate set of clauses in the context of an HMO property where there is a potential for prosecution if it's breached. But in practice, it depends on the scenario. If that person's got somewhere else to live and is clearly living somewhere else as well and just happens to be spending a lot of time here because they haven't got fed up of their boy/girlfriend yet, then they're not resident there.
Indeed. So this week on Property Tribes, it's all about prevention. We want to give you the information to make sure that you are a compliant HMO landlord. David has produced some fantastic content which will be posted each day throughout the week. And David, you've actually done this because you believe in prevention, but a lot of your work is actually about cure because you represent landlords who are being prosecuted. Tell us a little bit about that.
I suppose you could argue I'm doing myself out of fees,
well,
but I'm quite sure I will continue to get work. Just hopefully less from people who view Property Tribes videos. Yeah, I mean, there aren't, in fact, many people specialising in property who deal with crime as well. Most crime lawyers are much more focused on what you might call everyday street crime, like theft and petty violence and things like that. So it can be quite hard to find someone who covers both areas. We do it quite a lot. We've built up quite a strong specialist niche in it. And that's quite helpful because we're able to give landlords the specialist representation that these kind of cases deserve, and that seems to be borne out with results in that the overwhelming majority of charges laid against our landlords are in fact dropped or dismissed. That's not to say that some people don't get prosecuted, but in general most of our clients get prosecuted for less, so fewer charges than are laid, and tend to get lower fines. And in some cases, we're very successful in getting these things dropped at an early stage altogether. Can't guarantee things, obviously, but it's important to take good quality advice at an early stage because there are no do-overs with crime. I get quite a few people come along and see me saying, "Oh, I pled guilty last week. Can I change my mind?" The answer is not really. It is notionally possible in very limited cases, but it's pretty hard to do. So get some advice before you turn up at court.
Indeed, and we do, and I think finally, just to say, there will be landlords out there that think that they can fly under the radar. You are seeing prosecutions, and I think we should also point out that the tenant can report the landlord to the local authority as well. So it's very high risk not to adhere to this compliance, isn't it?
Yeah, I think there are undoubtedly landlords who think that it's a lottery and they might get away with it. It's worth pointing out the government is really focused on improving enforcement. They've done a lot to enable tenants to get their own enforcement activity. It's now open to tenants, in fact, to bypass the local authority altogether and seek a rent repayment order directly against the landlord for up to 12 months of their rent back where the property is not licensed, regardless of whether the local authority has ever heard of the property or prosecuted the property or not. So there are real risks increasingly for landlords, and the government's done a lot to allow tenants to self-enforce their rights, while at the same time making it easier for local authorities to pursue prosecutions as well by taking away the need to prosecute and introducing a civil penalty system. And a lot of local authorities have really jumped on that. So landlords who think they can bypass enforcement, my message is to you, probably not for much longer. And I would seriously advise you to reconsider that position.
Well, the timing of this week is great because the new legislation comes in on the 1st of October. But as long as you have applied correctly for a licence, that is the main thing at this stage, isn't it, David?
Yeah, in practice, if you've made a licence application that's valid, that's as good as having a licence, so you don't need to worry too much about the local authority getting on and doing the job, as long as you've got a valid application before them. That's the critical item here.
Fantastic. Well, thank you so much for your contributions to HMO Compliance Week here on Property Tribes. Stay tuned because every day David is going to be on hand with video content addressing different issues of HMO compliance. And having heard the recordings this afternoon, David, I've actually learnt a great deal as well. So thanks very much for helping us create awareness of HMO compliance through this themed week of content. So stay tuned, lots more to come.